Continuing to talk about Pacers players, upcoming free agency. Today we're going to do three guys who have weird free agency periods and all merit a segment but not a full show. Duane Washington Jr., Ricky Rubio, and Kiefer Sykes. What might free agency hold for those Pacers guards? Will the Pacers bring them back? We'll talk about it all in today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers, as always. My name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News, and today we're going back in to the Pacers player free agency series, looking at three guys who are sort of free agents, but sort of not. I'll explain in all of their individual segments. Today we're looking at some guards who fit this bill and whose situations do not merit an entire podcast. Duane Washington, Ricky Rubio, and Kiefer Sykes will be the subject of today's show. Apologies for those expecting shade and sharp draft content. This week has just been tough in terms of scheduling guests. A lot of stuff going on on the back end that's made scheduling hard. Everybody's fine. Everybody's doing well. And then shade and sharp will be coming next week. I apologize for setting that expectation. I hope everybody still enjoys today's show. Looking at free agency previews, let's start with Duane Washington Jr. Duane Washington, wonderful first season with the Pacers, going from an undrafted guy to in the rotation, started 7 times, played over 20 minutes a game in 48 games as a rookie, shot really well, 38% from deep, made quick decisions with the ball, 10 points per game scorer, one of the top 15 scorers as a rookie in all the NBA. Unfortunately, very poor defender, but his offensive potential and skills are there. And looks like at least a young piece that is worth exploring, if not more than that. So, wonderful first season, and that's why, if you'll recall, on the third to last day of the season, the Pacers promoted his contract. He was on a two-way all season long. There were no limits on two-ways this year, so he earned that promotion and got a longer-term deal. He ended up getting a 3-year deal with the first year at $950,000, and then at the minimum, the next 2 seasons, non-guaranteed both of those seasons. So, yes, he got a 3-year deal worth something like $4.5 million. No, that's too much. $3.5 million. There we go, math. And he deserved it. He was, again, a wonderful undrafted rookie who really was too good for the G League and showed off some impressive skills at the pro level, both in terms of his ability to make quick decisions, drive into the paint, and hit the 3 ball. And now he faces his first offseason at the pro level. And it's an interesting one because his contract is non-guaranteed, sort of. Some guys have non-guaranteed contracts for the full offseason. Remember Keelan Martin last year, his guarantee date kept getting pushed back. O'Shea Brissett's deal was non-guaranteed all last season. They don't become guaranteed till January, during the season. In Duane Washington's case, his contract becomes fully guaranteed if he is not waived by July 6th, 2022, 6 days in to free agency. And so he could end up being a free agent if the Pacers decide before or right at the beginning of free agency that they would like to move on from him and do something else with that cap space. So let's break down all the factors at play here for Duane Washington. Look, the biggest factor in his favor is he's somewhat talented. He's definitely talented on offense. Somewhat talented, young, cheap player. Like that is exactly what the Indiana Pacers at their current roster situation, their current money situation, should be looking for. Guys who are young, cheap, and talented and could potentially be something good or potentially be part of the next great Pacers team or in that rotation. If they can't be, whatever. They're cheap and young. Like, you have ways to move off of them. It's not a big deal. That is exactly the type of player the Pacers should want. And the biggest pro for them keeping Duane Washington, beyond that he was a rotation player for them last year, is that he fits all of those criteria, right? Anyone in that group from last year seems like a near lock to be back with the Pacers next year, barring a trade. And he's still growing, right? That was something that impressed me about Duane Washington, is he clearly got better like as the season developed. Maybe not necessarily again on the defensive side of the ball, but his offensive palette really got more varied. His passing got a lot better as the season went on. Like in his last, I'm just going to make up like 10 appearances of the season, he got that assist number up over 2, which was not the case for him as a stat for most of the season. Was not a great passer necessarily. So that was a big thing for him. And that is something that if he can continue to grow it as the season progresses, right, could really transform the way I view him, and many view him as an offensive player, because he's just a raw scorer mostly right now. So the pros for bringing Duane Washington back: talented, young, cheap. Like, checks all the boxes that the Pacers would think about. Now, today's show is a lot of fringe guard guys, right? There's also a bunch of forwards who fit this group of kind of free agents, kind of not. Terry Taylor, Justin Anderson, Nate Hinton. We'll do that one at a different time. Today, we're talking about a lot of guards, and I need to set a baseline here because I talked about this with Lance Stephenson's free agency as well and on various player season recaps. The Pacers have a lot of guards under contract already heading into next season between Malcolm Brogdon and Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield and Chris Duarte and TJ McConnell and, in theory, Duane Washington as the sixth one. Right, they are already crowded at that position for a roster of 15. So if you look, the one, and it's very poor, but one, I guess, argument the Pacers could squint at in favor of not bringing Duane Washington back is like, let's say they somehow a crazy lopsided trade pops up in the Pacers' favor where they're taking in like 4 players for one on like day one of the offseason. They have to make waivers. They have to be way more than that. It have to be like 7 players for one. If that happens, then maybe they had to waive someone to make a lopsided trade legal. I would guess between like Washington, Brissett, and Terry Taylor, the non-guaranteed guys, they would move on from the guard just because they're deepest at that position. And of those young guys, I would think at least they would prefer to keep Brissett and Taylor. That's the only reason I can think of that they would even move on from him is like an insanely weird trade where they need to clear roster spots because by cutting Duane Washington, they're only freeing up a minimum's worth of space, which doesn't matter. You can always send guys to the minimum. And so it's super unlikely to me that the difference between the Pacers signing like a slam dunk free agent and not would be $1.8 million. If it was, yeah, maybe they would move on from him and find a way to get that money. But again, the reasons not to keep Duane Washington around next year are really poor. It's that he's the sixth, it's that he's the worst of the non-guaranteed deals in theory, and that, I guess potentially they would think of a way to use that money somewhere else, but there's not any good reason to spend 1 point. Like what's better use of a minimum contract than a talented young player who fits what Rick Carlisle does, which is play fast, try to get up those outside shots, a lot of movement, things like that. Duane Washington's good at all that stuff. So there's not a good reason to not bring him back. His defense obviously is a big concern, and if he's playing a bunch of minutes next year, he'll have to be better at that, or the Pacers might not be any good. But he's good enough on offense to make up for that, to me, in a way that you'd be willing to be and comfortable bringing him back on the contract that he has. And that early date, July 6th, means the Pacers have to make the decision effectively earlier than that. All the parts of free agency move so fast. There's not a lot of roster spots that they'll know before that guarantee date if Duane Washington's in their future plans. They wouldn't have converted his deal the way they did if they didn't at least want to have him back for at least one more year. Same kind of concept with Terry Taylor. So all the signs point to Duane Washington being back with the Pacers next year. I'd expect he starts the season with their team and into camp. And maybe this is a situation like with Keelan Martin last year where they push back the guarantee date. But again, it's a minimum deal. I don't get why they would necessarily do that, especially after negotiating with him right at the end of last season. So the pros for Duane Washington in free agency, if he even becomes a free agent, that would require the Pacers waiving him, is that he's good, young, and cheap. And that's exactly what the Pacers should be looking for. Still growing, does what Carlisle wants pretty well, right? That seems like a player the Pacers should want to keep around. So unless there's a slam dunk reason for the Pacers to free up a minimum salary amount of money, or they make the world's weirdest trade, I think there's a pretty good chance Duane Washington is back with the Pacers next year. So he's technically a free agent, had to cover all the factors at play here, but that's why these guys all deserve a segment worth of discussion, not a full show, because there's not enough good reasons for them to get rid of Duane Washington to me in a free agency setting. Maybe in a trade, that's totally different. But in a free agency setting, that makes any sense. I'd just be babbling for a whole show, but I can do a segment on it. So I would expect to see Duane Washington on the Pacers next year in some capacity, whether that's into camp through some portion of the season. Minimum guys are what they are, and we'll see how he ends up shaking out in terms of having an impact on the team next year. But from a free agency perspective, I would be pretty surprised if they just flat out cut him and he became a free agent and was not a part of the next iteration of the Pacers. Let's move on to Ricky Rubio, a guy who never played for the Pacers, but is maybe, at least from a cap perspective, their most interesting free agent. It's a very fascinating situation. We'll break it all down coming up in a second. First, though, let's talk about the good folks over at Built Bar. Summer is coming, and with summer, you're going to need some food on the go, and Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on family vacations, off to work, whatever you're going to. You can throw them in your bag, in your kids' backpacks, in your briefcase. Make sure that everyone and you has a bar so that you are refueled for your summer adventures. So what are Built Bars? They are the best tasting protein bars out there, 100% covered in chocolate protein bars that come in a ton of delicious flavors. So there's something for everybody. If that's not good enough for you, they've got like a puffs variety with marshmallow infusion. They've got a mixed box with 12 flavors so that you can try a bunch of them. You have absolutely got to try them. I love the peanut butter brownie flavor. The cookie dough is really popular. And not only are they delicious, they're also healthy. Most of them have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. You got to try them. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 when you check out, and you'll get 15% off your order. That promo code, again, is LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Thank you for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On NBA Big Board is the way to go for Pacers fans at this time. It's where they're covering the NBA draft here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Tons of great draft analysts, many of which who will be on the show, helping me break down prospects for you guys as the offseason chugs along. You've got to check it out. Ricky Rubio's upcoming free agency for the Pacers. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So, recall a time this season. April 7th. That is the day the Pacers cut Kiefer Sykes in order to open a roster spot that the Pacers could sign both Terry Taylor and Duane Washington. And that seems like such a minor transaction. You know, Duane Washington's better than Keifer. Great. They got the better guard locked up long term. But the Pacers could have cut Ricky Rubio instead of Kiefer Sykes at that time if they wanted to. Sykes was healthy and playing for them. Ricky Rubio's in Spain rehabbing from a torn ACL. Why did they cut Kiefer Sykes instead of Ricky Rubio? And we'll talk about Kiefer later. Because despite Ricky Rubio having an expiring contract heading into free agency, they have Ricky Rubio's full bird rights. He made $17 million last year in terms of getting paid between the Cavs and the Pacers. And so there are some juicy sign and trade scenarios for Ricky Rubio that make him a very interesting piece for the Pacers in free agency. Not that they would necessarily want to bring him back, although I guess I'll talk about it because I'm going to cover this the same way I'd cover any free agent. But the fact that they have this giant potential salary ballast to use in sign and trades is so fascinating from a free agency perspective. Ricky Rubio, a very interesting part of what the Pacers will be able to do this offseason. So the appeal of Ricky Rubio, not necessarily for the Pacers, although I guess for the Pacers, but the appeal of Ricky Rubio for any team needing a point guard. The last places he has gone, right? Ricky Rubio goes to Utah, bam, they ascend and become this pretty threatening team. And, you know, they never really amounted to much at the current core of the Jazz. Who knows where they end up? The season before he got there, they lost, they weren't as good. They won fewer games. He shows up, boom, 48-win team. Then, boom, a 50-win team with him there. They get to the conference semis, right? He helped set a culture there. He left. They have fallen apart. And then he goes to Phoenix and helps grow them into that team that goes undefeated in the bubble and is on the precipice of being awesome and then is traded for Chris Paul, but helped grow the culture there. And then he goes to Minnesota and helps grow that culture and turns that team from a cellar team to a serious squad that ends up making the play-in 1 year later. And then he goes to Cleveland and helps grow that team from a nothing squad into a serious team, right? Lots of places Ricky Rubio goes and just helps set a culture and a foundation for the next good team in that franchise. He's been a part of it in a few places like Utah and Cleveland this year until he tore his ACL. Sometimes it's after he's there, like Minnesota and Phoenix, but that is valuable to these teams. And he is talented when he plays. Like, he's not necessarily this dynamic scorer, good shooter, but still one of the best passers in the league in terms of creativity. He's quick and shifty. He's a smart defender, right? He is a good player. There's a reason, if you'll recall, many of you will, that the Pacers were rumored to be signing him in 2019 before he ended up going to Phoenix. You know, they ended up with Brogdon, but those rumors were very much out there that the Pacers were interested in signing Ricky Rubio that summer for the same reasons that a lot of teams were. Like, he is a fine starter, a very quality backup, as the Cavs learned this year, and just a valuable piece to have on your team as a veteran. So, even though he's coming off of a torn ACL in December, he might not be ready for the very start of this upcoming season. He still could, over the life of his next deal, have some value to another team going forward. He did just turn 31 this past season. He'll be 32 on opening night of this coming season. So he's probably got about 2 or 3 good years left, but that's just enough for him to have some value to another franchise. So why would the Pacers or any team want Ricky Rubio? That is why. For the Pacers' perspective specifically, they probably, and by probably I mean almost certainly, will not re-sign Ricky Rubio without a ton of trades elsewhere, right? like I just talked about with Duane Washington and on Lane Stevenson's free agency show and a bunch of times on Locked On Pacers, they have a ton of guards returning. I just said that in the first segment, at least 6 before any trades happen. If they sign Ricky Rubio, like what's TJ McConnell's role all of a sudden? Where does Duane Washington fit in? Like there are guards that will not be playing as much. And Ricky Rubio is not worth that, especially for a team that doesn't want over 30-year-old guys soaking up minutes instead of young guys, right? So there's not any reason for the Pacers to sign Ricky Rubio, especially coming off of an ACL tear where his effectiveness will not really be known. But that does not mean Ricky Rubio is valueless to the Pacers in free agency. In fact, quite the opposite. And how lucky that the day I decided to do this, there is big news in the NBA that Robert Covington is going to sign a 2-year, $24 million-ish, we don't have the official numbers yet, extension with the Clippers. Why is that interesting? Why is that relevant to talking about Ricky Rubio? Well, Robert Covington is a solid wing, a pretty good NBA player, who was worth more than the mid-level exception. And his contract was set to expire this offseason. He was going to become a free agent. And he decided to re-up with the Clippers on that deal. And at $24 million, he's getting more than the MLE for each of the next 2 seasons, which means effectively any team without cap space would not have been able to afford Robert Covington at this price. And then the teams that would have signed Robert Covington at that price or would have had the means to do it don't want Robert Covington. They're either trying to sign young guys or are on a building path where Robert Covington doesn't make sense. And so instead of getting to free agency and re-signing with the Clippers on the same contract, he said, I'll just do it now, right? And so because this is such an interesting upcoming free agency period where there's not a lot of teams with cap space, the ones that do aren't necessarily going to be going after like that level of vet, and the full MLE might not be enough for some of these guys, right? The money situation for some of these free agents might be that there will be a lot of deals just like that, a little bit above 10 million. And so, how does this apply to Ricky Rubio? Well, maybe Ricky Rubio coming off of an ACL tear is not worth what I'm about to say. The MLE is 10 million this offseason. But Ricky Rubio was better than TJ McConnell last year when he was playing, who got 8 million from the Pacers. Ricky Rubio's been better. He got 17 million from the Suns 3 years ago, right? Like contractually and in terms of the numbers and just how he plays, like all the signs say Ricky Rubio is a better player than TJ McConnell. And I'm using that as a barometer to say there's a chance Ricky Rubio is worth more than the MLE. And that matters because then no team can sign Ricky Rubio to the contract he is worth except the Pacers. And that's where this all comes together to say the Pacers could sign and trade Ricky Rubio to a team that wants him and then gets his full bird rights and can put him in the rotation. And that could allow the Pacers, even on the simplest level, to just create a trade exception like they did with Doug McDermott last year. They traded Doug McDermott to the Spurs for nothing in return, just got a trade exception back. Or they could trade him for some other crappy money and pick up an asset along the way. Or they could trade him for a piece that is a forward and maybe helps them at a position of need, right? Because they have his full bird rights and they can sign him to any deal. And he could be worth at or more than the MLE and not be able to be afforded by a lot of these teams. There's a really good chance to me that there's some interesting Ricky Rubio signage right out there. And the Pacers obviously know this. That's why they didn't cut him at the end of the season. And so that is why Ricky Rubio was on the Pacers at the end of the season and why he has a ton of interesting value to me this offseason as a free agent for the Pacers. Not because they would bring him back, but because they can use him in a lot of creative ways in trades. Sign and trade deals are interesting because they have to be for 3 years in length, but only the first year of those 3 years has to be guaranteed. So like a team that's trying to get off of like a 2-year salary that's really crappy money could decide they'll trade it for Ricky Rubio, who's being signed and traded by the Pacers on a 3-year deal, but only the first year is guaranteed. And then they have 1 year of Ricky Rubio. They get off their bad money. The Pacers get an asset for Ricky Rubio. Boom, everybody wins. That kind of trade makes a lot of sense to me. Or, if the Pacers end up taking back a big money player in a trade and scooping up assets along the way there. I talked about that as an option from this offseason. I'll do a full show on that at some point. You could include Ricky Rubio's salary along with another Pacer in the trade to make it facilitated, right? Because they have his full bird rights, they can sign him to any deal, and because of the cap landscape this summer, Ricky Rubio could be a valuable piece for the Pacers to generate some form of value in return. If he ends up being worth more than that mid-level exception. If he's only like a $9 million player in the eyes of NBA teams, this is all stupid and pointless because then they could all just sign him using their full MLE. Now, that would probably not be a smart use of funds, I think, for him coming off of an ACL tear. But Ricky Rubio's situation, both his contract giving the Pacers full bird rights, his abilities on past teams, and his just general talent level, means to me it's not crazy at all that he could be a valuable sign and trade piece for the Pacers this summer. And that's why his free agency is so interesting to me. I don't know exactly what fits are out there for that salary slot. That would just be me guessing. I don't know what teams are interested. There's a lot of teams that could use a point guard. The Clippers, who just signed Covington, ironically, are one that could use a point guard. The Cavs maybe want Ricky Rubio back next year. Maybe if Sexton's back, they don't. But he was really valuable for them. Their whole season changed partially because he got hurt, right? Every contending team, maybe even the Nets, or I'm just making up teams that have like bad point guard situations off the bench that are contenders, would want a guy like Rubio. So his free agency is fascinating if it comes to fruition the way I described, where he could be signed and traded. The Pacers could extract some value from him despite him not playing a single game for the franchise. And that's why they didn't waive him, and that's why I'll be so interested in what happens to him this offseason. But from a Pacers perspective, to sum it up, I would say very little chance Ricky Rubio plays or is under contract with the Pacers next year, but a decent chance his name pops up attached to Pacers in reports in sign and trade transactions or in big sort of moves that kind of facilitate a lot going on with the Pacers or with some assets coming to the team. So I'll be very fascinated in all that as a cap dork, but it's possible that he just signs like 3 for 25 with some contender. We'll see, but I wanted to break it all down for you guys. Last one, Kiefer Sykes, who did not finish the season with the Pacers. What's coming up for him this free agency period? Would the Pacers have interest in bringing him back? What might that look like? Let's talk about all that. But first, I want to talk about BetOnline.net, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, and this weekend's run to the Roses at the Kentucky Derby. Back all at BetOnline.net. Actually, avoid the baseball part because the Phillies blew a 6-run lead in the ninth inning tonight, so I'm pretending baseball does not exist. And BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information. You can check it all out there. They got the playoffs up for Friday's games already up there. Heat favored by 2.5 on the road in Philly. TBD on Joel Embiid status. Mavs and Suns deadlocked on the money line. We will see in those games, but you can get all those lines at betonline.net. Go check it out. Head over to that website today or use your mobile device to sign up. See more of the trends in the action. BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On NBA is the way to go. Adam Mares and Wes Goldberg, your Friday hosts, take you around the league with the latest and greatest news in the coaching carousel, the draft front, everywhere. They got it. There were no playoff games yesterday, so they'll be previewing action, talking about the league. They're a fantastic show for us on the Friday of the Locked On Podcast Network. Kiefer Sykes free agency did not technically end the season with the Pacers, so a little bit of an interesting one here. So here's the thing. Kiefer Sykes, we did his season review already a few weeks ago. We were talking about backup guards, and for a minute, he was a big savior for the Pacers this season, right? They were really struggling to get quality backup point guard minutes from Brad Wanamaker, and Karis LeVert was injured, and TJ McConnell was hurt, and Kiefer Sykes saved them for about 2 weeks, where he came in and was shooting really well and was passing really well and earned a spot on the team. And then his effectiveness completely fell off. And so his season was really strange in terms of a really big ramp up through the G League and through Summer League. Rick Carlisle starts to like him. He gets with the Pacers, plays really well, and then just crashes really hard until the very end of the season. So really kind of hard to evaluate who he is as a player, but in general just seems like a kind of inconsistent depth guard at this stage. So with that kind of scene set, he didn't finish the season with the Pacers. That doesn't mean it's impossible they re-sign him. And so that is sort of where things would start, is like, if the Pacers needed a depth guard, Rick Carlisle did talk highly of Kiefer Sykes at times this past season. Like, is that a guy they'd be willing to bring back as a seventh guard instead of someone like Lance Stevenson, or instead of a different seventh guard? Maybe, he did have a really strong stretch again, right when he signed through like the first 2 weeks he was there. His last 4 appearances with the Pacers went really well before getting waived. Like, he did have stretches where he played well for the Pacers. So perhaps they want some stability in that depth spot at a backup guard. They can sign him to a two-way if they want. That's a big pro. That would be the reasons to bring back Kiefer Sykes, is to get a cheap, maybe even a non-guaranteed deal, really depth guard. And like, I'm a big proponent of having as many quality point guards as you can on a roster, because you need good ball handling to be a good team. And so if he is your 4th or 5th option at point guard, that seems like a good thing. That said, there's only so many spots on an NBA roster, and like we talked about with Duane Washington and Ricky Rubio, There are not a lot of guard spots on the Pacers next season, right? They have 600 contract already. I've already gone through this. There's not a lot of minutes there. There's not a lot of roster spots for the Pacers in free agency in general this year, right? Only a few guys come off the books for them at all. So bringing in a guy like Kiefer Sykes takes up one of those spots for a guard who's not even going to play most of the time. That doesn't seem like a good use of resources. And in terms of his just general fit with where the Pacers are headed, right? When he was signed to the team this year in late December, their season was definitely slipping away, but it wasn't out of reach, right? It was possible the Pacers could turn things around at that stage. And so they wanted the veteran depth, and he was 27 at the time. He turned 28 right after signing. And now he is 28, and that is the wrong side of the age bell curve for the Pacers, I think. I think he's probably a little outside of the age range the Pacers would want for a rebuilding perspective. And I also think that his really inefficient stretch, right, after going 6 for 10 against Brooklyn is really going to hurt him when his season looks back up on. From January 8th through March 24th of this past season, Kiefer Sykes played in 23 games, shot 30.6% from the field, 25.5% from deep, was good from the free throw line, is a quality defender, especially nosy on the ball, but he just was so inefficient that it was hard to play him on the ball. And so he's playing off ball a little bit, but that he's not as natural at. So there was a lot of conflict with, kind of the best way to use him and the best way for him to help the team were kind of different, if that makes sense, with Lance Stephenson's inclusion on the team and some guys getting back from injuries. So his effectiveness completely waned. And so as you look back on his season, he had that really strong stretch and provided them some needed depth, but his inefficiencies and his age make it seem like there'd be better options for the Pacers as a depth guard than Kiefer Sykes in general. Like they could just scour for any old random vet. If they want Kiefer Sykes back, they want Kiefer Sykes back. But like any old random vet provides about the same value. And there's also young guys they could bring in on a minimum deal that maybe offer a little more value or at least a little more upside that the Pacers could pursue. Like Hal Neto got a minimum deal last year, and he's much better than a guy like Kiefer Sykes who got the minimum from the Pacers. Just for example, I think Ish Smith got a minimum maybe just over that last year with Charlotte. Like there are quality minimum contract backup point guards out there. And so, yes, if you're signing Kiefer Sykes to be your seventh man, that's a little different. But there's not a lot of pros to bringing him back to me. Like they already are really set at guard. There are better options, even incumbent options like Lance Stephenson to fill that spot if they need a seventh guard. And so, while Sykes had a wonderful story, great dude, big, like a lot of people in the organization are big fans of him, I don't necessarily think there's a fit for him on the Pacers next season. Not to say he doesn't have a fit somewhere in the league or at least in the league ecosystem, but it seems like the Pacers could better use their resources elsewhere instead of bringing him back. Like him being a stable seventh man depth does not necessarily mean that there are not better options for that exact role. And his struggles throughout the whole season make me think that I don't think this is something the Pacers will pursue, not that it's impossible. Now, here is one thing that is in Kiefer Sykes' favor and might not necessarily be true for a ton of other potential guard free agents for the Pacers. Because he only has 1 year of service, he is eligible for a two-way contract, right? And that's a big deal. He was really good in the G League last year. Like, obviously, he got called up by the Pacers, but he was really good in the G League last year. He was even decent in the G League in prior stops in the league. Like, got the preseason action with the Spurs a few years ago. Like, he can, if you're better than the G League, that doesn't mean you're an NBA level player, but it does mean you'll at least fit in a lot of the time when you're on the NBA court and won't embarrass yourself. And Kiefer is definitely like better than the G League level. So I think a lot of G League teams would pursue him this offseason, perhaps the Mad Ants are one of them. And that means he could be a good two-way candidate. Like if you're a really good team who needs point guard depth and a creative way to get it, like the Clippers, for example, or really any contender who might need cheap ways to have depth next year, having Kiefer Sykes on a two-way deal seems like a kind of good use of a roster spot. Now, for the Pacers, again, who have a bunch of guards, maybe not so much. But for a lot of teams, there is a way to me that having Kiefer Sykes on a two-way contract makes a lot of sense and is a good use of allocating resources. So from a Pacers perspective, I don't think Kiefer Sykes will be in their plans this offseason. And from Kiefer Sykes' perspective, I think he should try to go somewhere where he either can get guaranteed money or guaranteed spot on an NBA roster, or a G League organization where he can get a ton of minutes to feature himself and continue to fight for an NBA spot. Because he earned it this year. He was certainly good enough in the G League and good enough at the start of the season for the Pacers. But now that the Pacers roster situation is what it is and their money situation is what it is, it seems unlikely that he'll be back with the team. So this was a fun one. I really enjoyed that all three of these free agents, Washington, Rubio, and Sykes, had a lot of different factors at play for all of them that kind of play into their offseason. And I'll be very curious where each of them end up. It seems like Washington will be back with the Pacers, but Rubio and Sykes, how the Pacers decide to navigate their off seasons and have those guys land, will be very interesting to me, especially in Rubio's case, where he could kind of be a part of what the Pacers offseason is, despite not being a guy that will end up on the team next year. So thank you guys a ton for listening today. Sorry again for having another non-guest show today. I tried to have one, but things did not work out. So we'll be talking next week about more prospects, more of these free agency profiles, get a little bit into draft lottery stuff because it's only in 10 days, 11 days from now. It's sneaking up very quickly. So stay tuned for all that. We'll have prospect breakdown coming on Monday. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and we will see you then.